And that is the end of that conversation is a great transition to our next panel, which will focus on the climate crisis and how it intersects with water and sanitation. At the UN headquarters yesterday, one of the speakers said that kind of climate change is the underlying DNA to the whole conversation this week. So we are privileged to be joined by a set of experts who will talk this through with us. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Catarina de Albuquerque, who is the CEO of Sanitation and Water for All, where she's a powerful advocate for the human right to water and sanitation. I'd also like to welcome Jeffrey Goldberg, who is director of USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation, and Hygiene, where he manages agency-wide efforts to implement the U.S. Global Water Strategy and serves as USAID Washington's technical lead on water and sanitation finance. And then I'd also like to welcome Bruce Gordon, who is the unit head of water, sanitation, hygiene, and health at the World Health Organization, where he oversees a global portfolio of water and health-related work, ranging from the development of norms on drinking water and wastewater sanitation to global monitoring of access to wash and burden of disease. And then finally, Helena Dollimore, who is the global lead of sustainability in health and well-being at Unilever, where she leads the company's wash work. Thank you all for joining us. So I want to start with Catarina. Could you kind of set the scene for us about kind of how climate change is impacting water and sanitation?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today with you. It's a great pleasure, and I hope that we all have the energy to answer your questions, because this conference has been pretty intense. So to set the scene, maybe with you I don't need to set the scene. I will still do it. I don't need to set the scene, because we all have it in the news. We all see it in the news, right? Jackson, Mississippi, floods. The impact of floods on people, right? The fact that the aging water infrastructure in the city simply collapsed. People lost access to water. They couldn't flush the toilets. But then you go to other parts of the world and you see droughts and droughts and droughts. People without access to water, even in places where the lack of water or water was not even a topic of discussion because it was abundant. You turn on the tap and it's there. Now and I see for myself, nobody at dinners and with friends, nobody talked with me about my job. Now they do. And they ask me, oh, this is worrying, isn't it? There is no water. There is no rain. So it's really in the news. And again, the floods in Pakistan last year, in the Horn of Africa, the lack of water, or even the storms. So what we see is the following. The whole world, there is no single country in the world where the human rights to water and sanitation are being fully realized. That's fact number one. Fact number two, with climate change, namely what I'm telling you about now, things are only getting worse. We had that meeting today with the World Bank where figures were being presented for Africa where the numbers are going backwards. The numbers of people without access is growing, and one of the factors is obviously climate change. One last word, one last sentence. Who is being hit the most? The most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the poor people who were already struggling to get access to these basic human rights.
Thank you. Bruce, can you kind of back off of that and talk about kind of the intersection of health and climate change and kind of how that also intersects with WASH?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to piggyback just by also noting that the meeting that Catarina mentioned, because the earlier question we heard addressed to Kate was, is the conference going to make a difference? And you mentioned Malawi and the commitment of Malawi to kind of deal with cholera. So we had a great opportunity to talk with the Minister of Water of cholera. And one of the interesting things is, as Kate was saying, we've got this kind of tension between emergencies and longer-term prevention, and I think that is the opportunity for us to find a sweet spot. In other words, no longer soap, no longer, just these emergencies, I shouldn't say no longer soap, don't quote me on that, but just this idea of really kind of, we need alternative water sources. But what we really need also is win-win solutions. So things that are less obvious. So Kate oversees a program where we're looking at increasing the use of safe wastewater for agriculture. So what does that give us? That gives us improved food security, that gives us more water, that gives us increased health. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to be doing more of, and that they just make sense anyway. So, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of water and sanitation related ministers and efforts here. And I think that the health sector really needs to kind of interact a little bit more closely so that there's better targeting where there's disease outbreaks. So using some of that health data to actually target interventions, so it's not just we'll get there ultimately in 2030, but we'll get there to the marginalized people in the next months, weeks, months, years. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do something hard, and that's intersectoral collaboration.
And why has that integration kind of not happened previously? What's standing in the way of that?
I think within any organization, a donor organization or a government, we are necessarily kind of in silos. And even in WHO, Kate mentioned the Global Task Force on Cholera Control, but they have their own group of stakeholders. And the thing they want the most is to harness some of the WASH financing and government commitment to deal with cholera. But they have their community, and the government ministers have another community. So somehow we've got to have the courage, again, kind of a platitude, but to break out of that, and to break out of entrenched institutional kind of organizational kind of setups, right? Organograms even.
And Jeffrey, so the U.S. government came out last year with its water strategy, and kind of within that, USAID set specific targets for climate resilience, water, sanitation, and financing. Can you talk a bit about how USAID is thinking about climate resilient finance?
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to echo the thanks. It's really great to be here. Exciting to see many colleagues in person and be up here with these friends. So we did come out with our whole of government global water strategy last year, and I'm just reflecting the urgency of the climate crisis. I think for me the true litmus test is if you word search within the strategy. I think climate is referenced well over 100 or 150 times, which speaks to just how critical this is within the U.S. government and within the investments that we're making. So the specific commitments, so we last year at the World Water Forum made USAID's first ever multi-year funding commitment of $1.2 billion over the next 3 years. And this week we were really thrilled to come and announce that of that $1.2 billion, we're dedicating more than half, $700 million, to our 22 high priority countries, again, over the next 3 years, 16 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa and actually represent more than half of the people worldwide who still lack access to drinking water and sanitation. And that also builds on the strong commitments that we came to the COP with, where we pledged to mobilize $1 billion in new public and private capital for climate resilient WASH. So we've talked a lot about our commitments, but to your question, kind of what does this mean in practice? And so we're really taking a proactive approach to make sure that we're creating new project structures and building project pipelines that push that climate integration and push us to really think about making sure that we're looking at things like methane emissions from on-site sanitation and wastewater treatment plants, and looking at attracting carbon credits for sanitation services and desludging services, and being able to leverage additional finance from climate financiers. So, really our sweet spot that we view is we don't really invest as an agency in hard infrastructure. We've kind of taken a hard look over the past decade at our practices and pivoted more towards technical assistance to make sure that we're taking that systems approach. And through that, we're really looking at bundling the finance needs of smaller utilities and wastewater plants to look at how we can aggregate these financing needs and push towards climate-sensitive interventions like solar and transitions that we know are critical, but only with kind of a concerted approach. So just to bring that to life a little bit, in Kenya, our WashFin, our WASH financing program, mobilized over $600,000 for climate change adaptation in 2021 by helping sanitation service providers access capital to develop fecal sludge treatment infrastructure, thereby reducing sanitation-related emissions, enhancing climate-related flood risks, and preventing groundwater contamination and the like. So we're really optimistic about crowding in climate-resilient investments, but it takes a concerted effort from a strategic level and making sure that we're creating the right incentives within our own organization to make sure that our field missions are reporting against these climate targets and designing investments accordingly.
And Helena, what kind of innovations and new business models has Unilever implemented to incorporate climate resilience into your approach?
Well, climate is such a huge threat to all of us, and Unilever, as one of the world's largest consumer goods companies, over 3.5 billion people use our products every day. We already see acutely the impact of climate change and of water scarcity in our operations at every layer of the value chain, really. If we think about our manufacturing sites and our factories, we have a number of sites where already we're seeing the water scarcity getting to such a level that we're having to truck water in, which of course leads to increased costs as a business. In our wider value chain, of course, our crops are affected by droughts, by floods, and that increases the difficulties of obtaining crops. And we also see that for many of our consumers who are living in areas affected by droughts or by flooding, it becomes harder and harder to use our products. A shower gel relies on running water. A soap relies on running water. So we are seeing the effects of the water scarcity and climate change throughout our value chain and at every level. And we've developed a number of innovations to look at how we can address this. One of our most successful models is the Savida water centres in India. And that's an innovative model with HSBC and the local government in India. We've opened 10 of these centres. And what they do is they operate in the urban centres in India where people may not have access to basic hygiene facilities, shower facilities, laundry facilities. And it's a centre where people can come and for an extremely low, very affordable cost, use those facilities in a safe way, and it's a completely closed loop in terms of the water usage. So all of the water is reused, it collects rainwater as well, and it's a very accessible way of improving access to wash while at the same time limiting our environmental footprint. We're also looking at lots of product innovations, and we have a number of products that, for example, the Omo laundry formula, which means you need a lot less water to rinse, sometimes no water to rinse. We have, of course, shampoo bars, which people will have come familiar with, and as we saw in the pandemic, an increasing use of sanitizer where necessary as well. So lots of product innovations. And of course, there's a wider shift as well that we're discussing in terms of the climate emergency and the move to plant-based foods. And we know that plant-based foods also use less water. So thinking about how we can shift consumer behavior towards that as well. But I think if we think about the effects of the climate emergency, and as Catarina has said, we are already so off track on SDG 6. We know that promise that the world made to give everybody access to clean water, hygiene and sanitation by 2030. We know how widely off track we are, and time is running out. And then when you add in the effects of the climate emergency on top of that, we are seriously off track, and everybody's got to up their game, whether it's businesses like us, governments, civil society, everybody's got to step up.
And Catarina, last year at COP27, there was kind of, for the first time, a new link between water and climate. Can you talk a bit about that?
Thank you so much. Happy to talk about that, but then also happy to make the links with what not only Bruce, several of the previous speakers were saying. Yes, I think that the government of Egypt from the outset said water is one of our priorities for whichever reasons, but it is one of our priority area. Well, it's a country that lacks water, Egypt, and we know it. And they dedicated a water day at the conference. For the first time ever, water was mentioned in the COP cover decision. It was mentioned actually in 2 out of 30 adaptation targets for 2030. There was also a water pavilion that brought together so many of the water actors, wash and also non-wash. So there was a lot. Of course, it wasn't perfect because number one, sanitation was still left out of the equation, and there still aren't any ties with climate mitigation, which, as we know, is really crucial. Now, what can we do? We can criticize the climate people for not having done it, or we can say, maybe there is something we can do. And I do think there is a lot that we can do from our side. And going back to what you were saying, Bruce, in terms of the silos exist in organizations like, any organization in the world, but inside ministries also. And what we have seen when talking at our partnership with our partner ministers was that, the water minister doesn't talk with the environment minister. Hence, there is no mutual infiltration of water in national adaptation plans, in nationally determined contributions, and vice versa. When the water minister comes up with a wonderful strategy or plan, they don't take into account, they don't incorporate any thoughts about climate. And this leads me to a word, which is political will. If we had politicians in every country in the world, that were committed to making things happen and to changing things, we would be there. And the other day, I'm very bad at maths. I'm a lawyer, but I managed to make these quick calculations. We have 7 years until 2030, right? And then I was thinking, President Kennedy made a statement in 1962 saying we shall put a man on the moon. What was the language? More or less this, right? We shall put a man on the moon. The men were put on the moon in 1969, 7 years later. So if we manage to put a man on the moon in 7 years, how come we don't manage to make sure that everyone gets access to water and sanitation? And it is. There are lots of factors that are indispensable, but it starts with political will. And my question is, how can we all in this room, what can we do in order to push governments to create this political will that can make miracles? Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, kind of what do you think we should do to create that political will? Like, what strategies do we need to move forward with?
So we have been saying we are a partnership, right? SWA. We bring together over 350 stakeholders, including everyone here on the podium, the organizations they represent. And we have been saying 3 things for this conference. We need AAA rating for this conference when it comes to water and sanitation. Number 1, we need ambition. Number 2, we need action. Number 3, we need accountability. And I think it's up to the different stakeholders to do it. The media has huge power. I don't need to tell you. You are a powerful woman. Now, you have huge power, and writing about it in an accessible manner, not in a technical manner, and I think that we need to abandon our jargon and move in the direction of the people in order to conquer them. I think civil society can move mountains and put pressure at the national level in order to make sure that the topic is elevated. SWA organized yesterday a wonderful event with heads of state and heads of government, because we are convinced that water and sanitation has to be elevated to the highest political level. We had several heads of state, the King of the Netherlands, and countries committing to finalizing a national WASH compact, presidential compact, over the next 6 months. And I said, well, the clock will start ticking this Saturday, because it's once the conference ends. So I think we all, I don't know you all, I don't know what you all do, but I think that try to think about, okay, how can I influence, how can my organization influence heads of state, heads of government, and at the national level, and mobilize things, put a process in motion to reach up and to make sure that the political will, and with political will comes, as Jeff was saying, the money and many other things. How can we make sure that it happens?
And what do you want to see out of COP28?
What I want to see, well, all the things that I said didn't happen in COP27, correct? Of course, more presence of more presence of water, obviously, more dialogues between the two, how do you call, the two sectors, visibility for sanitation, also the ties with mitigation. I think there is still so much, which is good. It keeps us going.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce, so you talked about the need to have intersectional collaboration and kind of this broader conversation around how there's this rallying call this week around ending the firefighting mode and moving into system strengthening. Can you talk a bit about what that looks like, and are there kind of examples around the world where that has been done well?
Well, I mean, I don't want to, I will use a common example, but in our session we had WASH as a driver for health, and we had the Minister of Water and Sanitation of India there, and I mean, that is just an exemplary example of you know, a full national scale, massive mobilization of funding and political commitment, and as the minister said, ownership by the people. And that was on sanitation, but also now on drinking water to pipe supplies to every rural household. And we worked with them, and we, you know, they're able to now, you know, kind of note that there's hundreds of thousands of lives that were saved. So, I mean, I think it is a bit of a frustrating narrative, because this political will that I think we're all talking about and that Catarina keeps mentioning, it's, you know, when you read about it, you're like, well, everything requires political will. But, you know, you could ask me that question and I could talk about technical solutions and climate resilience, sanitation safety plans and water safety plans and local risk assessments. And, you know, we need all those tools. But at the end of the day, I think we're all just kind of taken aback by, you know, there's this massive gap. And that's not necessarily going to be, well, it's not going to be solved with just this idea of we can provide technical solutions. One I think thing that I think we are working with, and I think that, you know, is going to help contribute to this, is this nebulous idea of what is climate resilient water and sanitation. I mean, if we were to say, you were to ask me how many, you know, people in the world are served with these types of services, I don't think any of us could answer. So I think we need to work collectively to kind of try to find some definitions, and it's not just infrastructure, it's management, it's, you know, policies that are sensitive to this. It's going to take some work, but I think if we're going to try to drive that accountability for climate resilient services, we do need to try to find some metrics to kind of understand if we're making progress. So I think that's quite important. There's one other thing I was going to say, but I can't remember. I'm dry now.
So Jeffrey, I'm wondering if you can kind of bounce off that. So you are financing climate resilient projects, and Bruce said there's kind of a nebulous definition around these. Like, what do you present to your implementing partners? How do they define a climate resilient project?
Yeah, Bruce couldn't have given me a better layup, because yeah, we've actually, I mean, it's almost as if you all kind of had been listening in on some of our internal conversations, because we've been asking that exact question as we wrote the strategy and put forth that commitment at the last COP under PREPARE, the President's Emergency Plan on Adaptation and Resilience. We were asking ourselves, what is climate resilient water and sanitation, and what do we mean by that? And so we had a long set of internal discussions, and we are really proud that we released USAID's first ever technical brief on climate resilient water and sanitation services through which, to all of our implementing partners, we're promoting 5 key building blocks that are grounded in systems thinking to mainstream climate resilience across all of our water and sanitation programs. And we're asking that stakeholders draw on these building blocks to design and implement water and sanitation programs. And these include policy and regulation, data and analysis, planning, budgeting and management, finance and behavior. And I think what's notable here is that these really aren't all that different than some of the standard building blocks that we talk about anyway, through SWA and through the sector writ large. But definitively, they have a climate lens over them, and we can't just be identifying climate risk through them. We're asking specifically that our partners look beyond the risks to activity implementation, and to Catarina's point, address the abysmally low inclusion of water and sanitation in NDCs and NAPs. I think from a systems, if we're looking at the building block on planning, budgeting, and management, you can't budget or manage to something that you haven't planned for as part of a NAP or an NDC. And just to kind of give you a sense of how this plays out through some of our programming, just considering data and analysis, our Philippines project has been working across secondary cities in the Philippines, working with water utilities to integrate climate information services into their decision-making processes, and specifically on source water diversification. So tracking surface and groundwater flows with predictive forecasting to help with improved planning to avert some of the crisis headlines that we've all been hearing about over the past several years, like a day zero type scenario in Cape Town. And so the intention there is to really proactively plan to make sure that it's not just the headlines like a day zero when everybody is reacting, because certainly that gets everybody's attention. At dinner parties that Catarina is going to, everyone's like, we're remembering now why this is important, but we want everyone to remember that it's important in the first place. And so really kind of proactively integrating that. But a bigger point that I want to draw on is that we really think that this is such a long-range issue and a generational issue that from a USAID perspective, it has to be more than just projects. We can't only be thinking about this from a projectized standpoint. And that's kind of a trope in the sense that we've always talked about that from a foreign assistance standpoint. But with climate change, it's that much more stark. So this morning, actually, our administrator, Samantha Power, released the new USAID policy framework writ large, which is called Progress, Not Programs. And it's a kind of a simple turn of phrase, but it's an important one, because if we're looking at climate resilience and longer range planning, each design of an individual project, whether it's by USAID as a bilateral donor or any other bilateral donor, needs to be thinking over a 30, 50-year horizon. And it can't be on that 5-year project cycle if we're really going to be making tangible headway in building climate resilient WASH. So, those are a couple examples, and encourage everybody to check out our tech brief on climate resilient water and sanitation. We felt it was a necessary addition to make sure that we're kind of walking the walk here with climate resilience, but we're eager to have the conversation with partners to make sure that we can collectively hone in on an approach.
Thank you. And turning to Helena, so Unilever kind of has a variety of WASH partnerships, and within kind of the climate resilience space, how we're going to need to kind of broaden partnerships like this and bring them to scale. What would you say is kind of, what lessons have you learned from these partnerships and bringing these projects to scale?
Yeah, well, we have a very long history of working on hygiene and promoting hygiene. We were founded in the 18th century in Northern England with a vision to make cleanliness commonplace, and that runs through what we do still today. Many of our brands you would find at home in your kitchen or your bathroom. Many of them are wash brands, toilet cleaners, soaps. And we choose to use our power and our scale as a business to change consumer behavior in the right way. So if I take hygiene behavior change, for example, our soap brand Lifebuoy runs hygiene behavior change across the world in schools, in communities, in healthcare settings to encourage hand washing with soap at key occasions. Our toilet brand Domestos also do a lot of work on installing toilet facilities in schools, but also they're not just installing them, but working with the local governments and working with the schools to make sure those facilities are maintained, because we know that installing the facilities is only half of it, and then improving the behaviour and ensuring the uptake is the other half of it. So that's a key focus for us. And one of our biggest partnerships in the last couple of years was in response to the pandemic. When the pandemic broke out, we teamed up with the UK government, the FCDO, to launch one of the biggest WASH programs that has ever been seen at a public-private partnership level, the Hygiene and Behaviour Change Coalition. It was a £100 million partnership with £50 million from the UK government and £50 million of a Unilever contribution in terms of soap products and other in-kind contributions. And we were operating in 37 countries with over 21 partners, UN partners, NGO partners, really ramping up access to WASH infrastructure, but also including the behaviour change element as well. Ramping up public information campaigns in countries where governments were not running them in relation to COVID-19 and the spread of the virus. Doing what we could to close those gaps of access that we know exist and were so exacerbated and obvious during the pandemic, the inequalities in access to WASH that existed. So that was a huge partnership. And what we learned from that, I think, firstly, we learned that if we'd have ever set out to do that in a context that wasn't a pandemic, we would still be sat in workshops trying to design that partnership 3 years later. So sometimes you come together in an emergency and you just make it happen and it works. So that would be the first learning. But secondly, it's that we've got to leverage the expertise of everyone who comes to the table. So we leverage the huge expertise of our hygiene brands in how you change consumers' behavior. There is a huge power in the marketing expertise that many of our marketeers bring. And when they apply that knowledge to the problem of how you get people to wash their hands, it has better results than if you use other methods. It's also true that when you have trusted brands that consumers trust, they are more likely to listen to a message from those brands. But also making sure that you're bringing the relevant expertise of all partners. So the NGO partners and their operations on the ground were absolutely key. The expertise of the UK government and the FCDO in applying the programme on the ground. So that would be the biggest recommendation, but also just making sure that we are scaling up what we are doing in terms of the challenge that we face, because we know the gap is so huge. Everybody's got to step up.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure the issue of climate and WASH will kind of be woven throughout all of our conversations today, but we've heard about the need for political will, the need to define climate resilience, the need to break down the silos, and kind of the role of the private sector, and some examples of projects globally that are working. So I want to thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us for this conversation.